Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of November. Today we have some updates, so let's start. And today we're going to start with LPR region, with north, with Svatove-Kreminna frontline, with this area. We can say that the previous 24 hours we saw the same stories, the same directions of attack and so on. The Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Kuzemovka, Novoselskaya, if we're talking about Kupiansk front line, and the Ukrainians were made one attempt to attack in direction of Chervonopopovka in this area. If we're talking about Ukrainian main goal on this direction, of course we understand that Ukrainians want and they need to take control or to get as close as possible, or if it's possible, to enter the forest, this area. And after that, of course, as they did this before, they will try to prepare fortifications in these forests, they will try to build trenches, they will try to prepare their positions and so on before winter comes and before this area will be covered with the snow. Furthermore, today, if we're talking about the Russians, they reported that Ukrainians have changed their tactics in this area. First of all, the Ukrainians started moving, let's say, already prepared fortification constructions. So some kind of bunkers, already prepared done bunkers, some kind of already prepared fire positions. And now the Ukrainians are preparing their fortification along this Zherebets river. It doesn't mean that Ukrainians lost their offensive capabilities and they're not planning to start counter-offensive operation or continue. That means that they understand that by winter, they don't have much time to develop a lot, and now they need to prepare. And maybe they won't be able to develop at all, so that's why they need to prepare their new front line in this area as fast as possible. Of course, the Ukrainians will try to prepare such a fortification as we can see in Donetsk around this town, where the Russians have been stuck and are not able to develop offensive operation or develop any progress in a fast mode. So this is the thing that the Ukrainians are trying to prepare right now on the Kupiansk front line. If we're talking about the losses, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost around 160 soldiers during the attempt of attack in direction of Novoselskaya and Kuzemovka, and around 7 armored vehicles. And if we're talking about Liman area, the Ukrainians were trying to attack the same towns, Plashanka and Chervonopopovka. They were trying to develop this bridgehead. And on this front line, the Ukrainians lost around 100 soldiers and 13 armored vehicles. And I'll repeat one more time. The Ukrainians are preparing fortification front line along Zherebets river with the usage of the already prepared fortification, like they prepared them some kind of plants, industrial zones, and then they're moving this fortification here. So they're not planning to give up or retreat or step back from these positions. If we are talking about Belogorovka Bakhmut frontline, today we continue receiving two different opposite understanding of the situation about these two Belogorovka. Some Russian sources were saying that the Russians got control over this Belogorovka, the north one. Another sources were saying that the Russians entered the south Belogorovka. This is two different situations, two different developments, because as we discussed yesterday, if the Russians entered the north Belogorovka, that means that Ukrainians, we can say, lost their capabilities to attack the Russians' direction of Svatove-Kreminna from Serebryanka, because now the Russians will try to develop their operation in direction of Grigorievka, Verkhnyokamyanskaya. They will try to return their lost positions in this area, and of course that will force the Ukrainians to leave these forests and to step back in direction of Serebryanka. From this perspective, of course, the Russians will be able to make their front line around Kreminna more stable, more powerful, more fortified, and more safe. And if we're talking about Belogorovka, the south one, Belogorovka, this is totally different picture. And if the Russians entered this Belogorovka, that means that the Russians penetrated the defense orders around Yakovlevka Vesele, and this is operation about taking control over over this small town, Solidar, Bakhmutskaya, and this operation is the beginning of the operation of encirclement of Bakhmut. So for now, there were no more updates about which Belogorovka was taken by the Russians, so let's wait a little bit. I believe that soon we're going to understand the real situation in this area. If we're talking about Bakhmut, we haven't received any update from this area during the previous 24 hours. It doesn't mean that there is no heavy clashes there. The Russians are storming, are pushing, are trying to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible. They're attacking this area heavily. There is a Telegram channel that was created by the locals from this town, from Bakhmut, and during the previous 24 hours they reported that they haven't seen such a day as today before, because the Russians were attacking this town with everything they have, with all types of artillery weapon, of all types of just a regular weapon, and there are very heavy clashes, and the Russians are storming and pushing Opytnaya. The Russians are getting closer to Pitgorodnya, to this district to the northeast part of Bakhmut and so on. But today we got some updates. The Russian source map has been updated, as you can see. And now the Russians are showing they have updated the border of the territory under their control. As you can see, this area, this is the green line, and there is two colors. One territory is just red color, this one without color. That means that the Russian source map has been updated, and this red line, this line between these two areas, used to be the previous front line. Now the Russians are saying that they established final control over this small village, over this residential area, and they got as close as possible to the railroad station Mayorska. And today the Russians published some videos of attacking against the Ukrainian tanks in this area, how they destroyed. So we can say and we understand that the Russians continue storming operation of Mayorska. This is a very important area. We discussed this logistics center where a lot of roads are connected and there are a lot of crosses, and the Ukrainians using this railroad station uses this station for let's say changing of the forces between Donetsk, New York agglomeration with this position. As you can see, there are a lot of blue lines. These blue lines, some of them appeared not very long time ago, maybe this weeks. All these lines shows, we can say, spotted from the satellites, fortification and trenches. As you can see, there are still a lot of job to do for the Russians. As you can see, there are two types of blue lines. These the blue lines, big blue lines, as you can see, they're pretty big. On the map we can see them, and if we take a look at the red area, there is small blue dots. You see these small blue dots, all this. So you need to understand that this is the same trenches, but the trenches with big blue lines means that the Russians still need to take them, and the blue dots like this means that the Russians have already got control over the trenches. As you can see on this map, starting from the right corner to the west, to the left corner, as you can see, there is maybe more than 100 dots saying that there used to be a lot of trenches that the Russians managed to take control over. And this is the next topic I would like to discuss with you, that the Russians, they haven't changed this tactic. They used this tactic since the beginning of the special operation. And I believe that for now, this is the only one possible offensive tactic that the Russians are able to use. We know that there are more Ukrainians on the front line than the Russians, and to attack the Ukrainians using straight attacks or trying to attack from the flanks or trying to encircle is the waste of time. The only one possible way how the Russians are able to get control over entire Ukraine is to attack step by step, slowly, by small steps, by reducing their own losses. In this case, the Ukrainian losses are also low, but the Ukrainian losses are bigger than the Russians. Let's say during the storming of one trenches in Kadema, like this one, maybe the Russians lost maybe 2 or 3 soldiers during this storm, but the Ukrainians lost around 10 soldiers. The losses are not so big in comparison with the offensive operation that Ukrainians made in Kherson district, when they lost for one day around few thousand soldiers. The losses are less, and from some perspective the Ukrainians are not counting these losses because they are so low. But if we're talking about the time, about the period of some certain period, I believe that the Ukrainians are losing their square meters and the Russians are moving forward more and more. So we see the situation, as I told you, there are still a lot of job to do. The Russians need to crack and penetrate the trenches, let's say Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka fortification area. The Russians still need to take control over Klishchevka fortification area. There are a lot of job to do, but they're doing this. But before they take Klishchenovka, Kurdyumovka, these front lines, and this Mayorsk, there are a lot of fortification around, they are not able to attack Bakhmutskaya. As you can see, there are a lot of fortifications appeared on the Seversk front line, so there are still a lot of job to do. Now let's move to the south, and now we are talking about Donetsk front line. As you can see, there are also a lot of blue dots, small dots, saying that the Russians managed to get control over them and they're moving further to the Oputnaya and Vadiana. As you can see, the Russian source map has been updated as well. Now we see the full colored red territory in this area. As you can see, they're showing these dots as a small one, meaning that the Russians maybe entered some kind of southeast part of Oputnaya. There are still some big trenches between these two areas, so there are still a lot of job to do, but the Russians, using their tactic of a very slow, small steps, they're pushing the Ukrainians. Of course, we understand that in this case, if we compare the Russians' attack in direction of Bakhmut and Donetsk, totally two different situations, because if the Russians attack in Bakhmut, they're not risking with anything. The only thing they are risking with is time, because such a way, using such method of offensive operation, I believe that they need maybe another 2 or 3 months before they will be able to get to Konstantinovka. Even more, if you're talking about winter, maybe by the March of the next year, or in April, the Russians will be able to get to Chasov Yar town or something like this. And if we're talking about Donetsk, the forces who are moving using the same method by very small steps, they have to pay with the casualties among civilians in the capital of DPR in Donetsk. Two different situations, but the Russians don't have any other option. They don't have possibility to attack in the flanks, trying to encircle. The only one way is to push slowly, step by step, to push. And as we know, if we're talking about Pesky bridgehead, the Russians are continued fighting near Oputnaya, between Spartak and Oputnaya, this area. They're clearing Vadiana, trying to complete this mission. They're moving in direction of Nitailova, in the small town by the name of Pervomayska. They're moving in direction of Nivolskaya. They're trying to take control over small farms between Nivolskaya and Pervomayska. So there are a lot of job to do. And if we're talking about other things, of course, they still need to, they haven't even started with operation in Krasnogorovka. This is another fortification, and without this town it's impossible to discuss the next steps in this area. And so there's and as you can see, Krasnogorovka is surrounded with the fields, so there are still a lot of job to do to get there, and I'm not sure how the Russians are even planning to do this. The Russians made a lot of attempts by attacking Mariinka, and as you can see, the Russian source map has been updated a little bit. They have added this small, let's say, triangle square on the north. This one showing that they managed to close as close as possible to this town Mariinka. Some sources were saying that during the previous storm of Mariinka, the Russians have reached this big road, this big line that separates this town in two pieces. Now we're moving to the Pavlovka, Vuhledar front line, to this area. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 90 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. But if we're talking about this area, the Russians, according to the Ministry of Defense, didn't make any attempt of storming this area. They didn't make any attempt. And but from the other side, the Ukrainians started their own counter-offensive operation. The first one was in direction from Novy-Mikhailivka to the south. For now, this area it has the fog of war, because I'm not sure that this front line shows the current position, and this I can show the real position where the Ukrainians made their counteroffensive operation. I believe that the Ukrainians made it a little bit to the north, because according to the latest update we got from the Russian side, they managed to enter, let's say, the south part of Novy-Mikhailivka. So the Ukrainians made a counteroffensive operation, and the same thing the Ukrainians made in Pavlovka. As you can see, according to the Russian source map, the map has been updated around Pavlovka. Now it shows this the real positions that is under Russian control. We can say that southeast part of Pavlovka is under Russian control. This town now split in 3 areas. The west part is completely under Ukrainians, the middle one is in the gray zone, and the southeast and east part is under Russian control. The Russians has changed their tactic in this area. I don't know why. I didn't thought about that before. But these days, more and more questions and more answers were received about Vuhledar, and the thing is, why the Russians didn't reduce this town to ruins? Why they're not attacking this area with artillery? Why they're not doing this? And some sources were saying that because of the fact that this is a residential area, and maybe the Russians wanted to save the buildings, maybe the Russians wanted to save these buildings and not to destroy this town. They wanted to make some attack to encircle this town, but during the previous months we understood that it's highly unlikely that the Russians are able to penetrate defense orders in this area and to take control over this town. So that's why the Russians changed their tactics, and now, as you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area, above this area, and every day there are more and more icons. The Russians changed their tactic. They now start attacking this town with anything with every single type of weapon they have, with artillery, with geranium, with shahed, with everything they have, and with one purpose: just to destroy and reduce the Ukrainian systems, units, armored vehicles, everything they have. So I believe that they will try to reduce this town. They will not play in this game. They will not lose their soldiers. They will just reduce this town, and after that they will enter this area. At least they will try to force the Ukrainians to step back from this town. But we know the Ukrainians, this is not the guys who is going to step back. Now we are moving to Zaporozhye area. There are no changes, no icons, just a few updates about the warehouses, about destroyed the ammo depot, and so on. Nothing more, no changes on the front line, no movements, there were no movements, and so on. And now we're moving to Kherson, the focal point of the previous 2 weeks discussions between everybody in the world. As you can see, there are a lot of icons, but there were no let's say active combat on the ground. The Russians reported that Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours were trying to send commandos. They were trying to cross the front line by sending commandos, scouts on the territory of Kherson to send them in the Russian back for some sabotage operation and so on. The Russians reported that Ukrainians made at least 9 attempts of doing this, but all those attempts were repulsed by the Russians, and as a result of those attempts, the Ukrainians lost around 50 commandos and around 17 vehicles, because mainly the Ukrainians were using civilian cars for these operations, for these purposes, but like mobile cars, fast cars, but the Ukrainians were destroyed in this area. As you can see, the Russians are shelling this area heavily. The Ukrainians are sending dozens of drones trying to investigate all this situation, all this area, trying to understand the Russian position, and they're preparing before upcoming offensive operation. I believe that, let's say like this: if we're going to see the negotiation process between Russian Federation and Ukraine, that means that we are going to see the Ukraine counteroffensive operation. Because as soon as negotiation ends, I'm not saying that they're going to be signed some peace agreements. As soon as negotiation process ends, the front line will be freezed and will be stabilized. So that's why, of course, it will be very good for both sides to develop and increase their bridgehead, because we understand that this front line can be freezed, but this situation, this war will be started the next year, in 2 years, no matter. But this war is not going to be ended by the freezing of the front line during the 2022 December negotiations or something like this. So if the negotiation starts, that means that before them the parties will try to develop their positions. The Ukrainians will try to get as close as possible to Kherson, just for one purpose, to establish fire control all along the river and not allow the Russians to build any bridges, any supply and support, doesn't matter. But they will try to get as close as possible. If we're talking about the Russians before the negotiation process, they need to take Vuhledar and take control of this territory, because if the next year the special operation start or war starts one more time, the Russians will have a better positions from Vuhledar and they will be able to to develop their attack easily from this position. The Russians need to develop their bridgehead around Donetsk before any freezing, any negotiation process, and they need to take Vadiane, Oputne, and at least to start something that looks like Avdiivka encirclement operation. I don't know what the Russians are planning to do with Bakhmut, because I believe that it's highly unlikely that the Russians are able to take control over Bakhmut before winter. They need another 2 or maybe 3 months before doing this, or at least half of Bakhmut. But anyway, the situation is critical, and for now I don't see any solution what the Russians are planning to do with Bakhmut during the negotiation process. Or maybe all this negotiation process is just a speculation and fake, just to calm down the people all over the world, trying to show that everything is under control or something like this. Anyway, we're going to see. And the 16th or the second half of November comes very soon, and we know that in the second half of November the temperature on the south of Ukraine is going to become below 0 by Celsius. That allows the both parties to use fields one more time and to attack the enemy using the broad front line tactic of attack. And that's it for today. Military Summary Channel reminds we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.